Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Internet Governance During Times of War and Conflict. My name is Daniel Castro. I'm Vice President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, or ITIF. For those of you that don't know ITIF, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank focusing on the intersection of technology and innovation. I want to welcome you to today's event. It is being streamed online and recorded. If you're watching the live stream and you'd like to ask questions of our panel, you can submit them via Slido. There's a link on the event webpage or in the video description if you're watching on social media. You can also vote on the questions that you want the panel to answer most if you don't have a question of your own. So the purpose of today's event is to discuss how Russia's invasion of Ukraine has highlighted the uncertainty about the future of the open internet. For many years, we've seen a number of authoritarian countries and others enact more controls to silence dissent, block access to media, spread disinformation, and censor people's voices on the internet. And yet these changes also come at a time that we're seeing more globalization, more decentralization, and more connectivity among people, businesses, and governments in all parts of the world. So, when I look at this, I really see a tension between competing visions of the internet, for the future of the internet, and also important questions that are on the horizon for how policymakers can support their desired outcomes for what the internet should look like. In the past month, there's also been a global response to Russia's military aggression in Ukraine, unlike anything we've seen in the internet era, raising important questions for companies providing online services to Russia. What's their responsibility, both legally and morally, in responding to this situation? And fundamental questions about, are they doing more good or harm by staying or leaving? And then we also have multi-stakeholder institutions that have been designed to coordinate technical questions about the functioning of the internet, that they're also facing scrutiny about their roles and responsibilities in these times of conflict. So my goal with today's conversation is to dive deep onto these issues and questions and ask not only what are we doing right or wrong right now, but how can policymakers, businesses, and civil society better be prepared in the future to address these types of complicated questions. So we have a really fantastic set of panelists here today to talk through these issues with us. I'll briefly introduce them. Everyone's bio is on the website. We have Fiona Alexander, who is a distinguished policy strategist at the American University School of International Service. Farzana Badi, founder of Digital Medusa. Stephen Feldstein, senior fellow of the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Mallory Nodal, chief technology officer for Center for Democracy and Technology. So first, thanks all of you for being here today. Why don't we start kind of with the big picture here? For those who are maybe less familiar with what's happening here, we have, of course, everyone's seen that many Western countries have left Russia in reaction to its invasion of Ukraine. How would you characterize the response from companies that are involved in providing online services, internet services, or related technology? Mallory, why don't we start with you?
Thanks. Yeah, happy to respond. I've been on a few of these, in a few of these discussions already, and I kind of keep going back to the same three things. That companies certainly need more guidance. This was also reflected in a civil society letter that was put out around, how sanctions should carve out the internet, and also that needs to be explicit and directives given, but also that I think it is a mistake to characterize companies keeping services running as apolitical or neutral. I think that that's actually quite a political stance to, keep connectivity at all costs, especially in times of war and conflict. And I think that there's more that companies could do to lean into that narrative that, they are actually helping Ukraine by making sure services are running there. And in framing it more in the positive. But I do think that there should be some very careful and detail-oriented descriptions and actions of both bad behavior and good behavior. I'll just mostly focus on bad behavior, but if you are a platform that is providing ISP internet connectivity, there's maybe some violations of of use of your services and so on that you might want to look at. Flooding, just like general routing issues, and action those. Again, behavior-based. If we're talking then about on the other end of the spectrum at social media platforms, look, if there's coordinated and authentic bot behavior, disinformation, absolutely, it needs to be actioned. It needs to be taken care of. There's a lot of middle ground in there too. So we need to think about, what are some internet companies, maybe like content delivery networks? What should they be doing? Should they be giving a megaphone to websites or services that are furthering the conflict? And how do they decide what those are? I think it's worth every individual company thinking about their role in this. And that's setting aside, like the obvious sorts of, complying with sanctions from a financial perspective. How do you actually make payments to staff that are in Russia now and that sort of thing? I'm not talking about those. I'm mostly talking about, how can companies get a lot better at understanding what their role is, how Russia as an adversary is abusing their company and their services, but then how also they can come up with proactive ways to support Ukraine connectivity as well.
Thanks. And I pretty much want to open this same question up to everyone. Maybe Fiona, we can go to you, and then Stephen Farzana. In particular, Fiona, I mean, obviously you've probably thought about these types of questions a lot in recent months. We've also seen how the government thinks about it in response to these types of situations. So I'd love to get your reflections on kind of where we are right now and whether the response is at the moment.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. Thanks very much for the invitation. And first, obviously what's happening in Ukraine is appalling, and I think everyone is concerned about what's happening to the people there. With respect to the issue at hand, I think it's important to keep in mind that sanctions already apply to the internet, right? So they always have, and it's just a matter of getting a license on certain things or figuring out how to handle it. My experience and exposure for my 20 years or so at NTIA was specific. At least a lot of my work was focused on the domain name system. And there have been long calls for conversations to take country codes away from countries that act in aggressive manners, whether it's an invasion like this or something else. And we can talk about some of the things we did in the past. But even under the current regime, pre the invasion of Ukraine, ICANN, which coordinates the domain name system, still has to get an OFAC license. So, I think it's important to keep in mind that there already are sanctions and there already are systems in place to deal with this before we start talking about what else is needed and what's not needed. I would just offer, the following thought, which is I think depending on where you are in the value chain of provision of internet services, maybe your response is different. And I think we're going to talk about this in a little bit later about the ICANN and the RIPE responses. But I think if you're coordinating a public core resource and you're coordinating a global resource, your response may be very different to a private company that's making trade-offs about how it wants to operate and how its customers think, and then also the safety of your staff who may be in country. So I think every company or every institution that's involved in the provision of internet services has to weigh the pros and cons and weigh the different factors that apply to them, depending on where they are in that system. The internet is not one network, it's a network of networks, and where you are in that stack may depend on how you react to what's going on.
Thanks so much for that, Steve.
Great. Look, I think Mallory and Fiona have offered a lot of really important insights. So I'll just try to build off a little bit about what they've already laid out, I think, pretty clearly. A couple points come to mind. I think, first of all, there's been a lot of talk that, the Ukrainian crisis represents a threshold moment when it comes to the splinternet, and the idea that we're seeing, a real carving up of the information space globally when it comes to platform restrictions and other types of controls. And I think that, it's a little bit of a misreading of the situation to sort of say the splinternet started as of 2 months ago. Many of the legal, laws in place, the restrictions that are being enacted, the practices that have been followed, the precedent that has been laid, it's taken years to develop this kind of ecosystem. And it's not just technical, it's also legal and it's political. And so, think about even in Russia, what has been necessary to get to a point where you can have legal authorizations of restrictions that can happen as, in fairly short order. It has taken the development of a repressive legal apparatus in order to allow that to happen. And that's something that, I think is reflected in many other countries around the world. The idea of landing laws, for example, that enforce localization limitations and ensure that companies appoint representatives on the ground who will be accountable to governments when it comes to enacting certain restrictions that the government orders. These are tactics that not only have recently occurred in Russia, but you see it in countries like Turkey, Uganda, and so on and so forth, Thailand. And so, I think what for me, what it really comes down to when it comes to information restrictions and constraints on the internet is that there's a very strong linkage to underlying political repression. And that maybe at one time there was more of a gap or separation between the two because the internet was not as it was not taken up as widely by citizens in earlier moment where governments didn't recognize the power of digital communications as a means to mobilize individuals against the power of incumbent regimes. And so you saw this sort of gap manifest itself in situations like the Color Revolutions and later Arab Spring. But we're no longer in that era. Governments have very well recognized what online mobilization can do in terms of threats to their power. And so now, this notion of a splinterment occurring, I mean, this is something that represents a trend line that has been in place for a while and perhaps is being accelerated further by the Ukrainian crisis. But frankly, it's something that a lot of us have been watching for a number of years.
Thanks, Steve. Farzana.
Thank you. When it comes to companies, private companies' action in reaction to a conflict or a war, I think when it comes to the internet, we also need to consider on which layer of the internet this is happening, and is it is it consequential for Russia only, or is it going to affect the rest of the world as well? Now, companies that provide online services have withdrawn from Russia to be symbolic, to actually condemn the act of Russia. But then also they have done this because the sanctions have increased on Russia. So it costs more to comply with those sanctions. So instead of investing in that, they've done a symbolic thing. And also, I think that we need to consider the effect of this. This condemnation is needed, but what is the effect when they withdraw? Are they really? Can they actually weaken those invaders, or are they actually? Is that not effective? And private companies can do what they want, but I think that in the equation they need to consider this. The other action that they have taken, it was because of withdrawal, was because they had employees of Ukrainian employees. Like, for example, some registrars had Ukrainian employees, and so they decided that they don't want to serve Russia. But I think that we really need to look at what is the effect and what are we trying to achieve when we withdraw a company from Russia. And I give you an example. In 2009, when there was the Iranian uprising, Nokia, apparently a protester was imprisoned and took Nokia to court later on because Nokia had allegedly sent the information about this person to the Iranian government. And Nokia said in a statement, I have to, when I incorporate in a country, I have to provide this commitment that I provide disclose information. And otherwise, I cannot serve that country. So these are all the elements that we need to understand, as well as considering that if we are doing this withdrawal, is it going to affect the internet as a global resource, or can we actually have a proportionate effect on the country that is invading others?
Thanks for that. So I want to continue along this theme of, Steve had mentioned, the splinter net. I guess the question I have here is, to what extent should this goal of an open internet remain kind of this top overriding policy priority? Fiona, maybe we can start with you on this. It seems like that's what really has colored a lot of the response, especially outside of the private sector, is this idea that the overriding goal should be to avoid this kind of splinter net scenario. Is that still the priority, or how do we balance that against other objectives?
Look, I think the idea of an open, interoperable global network is still the goal in terms of getting connectivity to people and having the free flow of goods and services, free flow of information. You'll notice that I said open, interoperable global network. It's a network of networks. It's always been splintered in some way. It's just where does it break and where's the splinters and how much is government enforced versus interoperability of standards. So again, I would still argue that we want an open, global, interoperable network, and we want to discourage governments from putting borders around their networks because that impacts information flows, it impacts commerce, it impacts negatively all the things that we would like to see happen. But the reality is that there always has been sort of these borders put up around the internet, and it hasn't always been, authoritarian regimes. Here in the United States, there are certain things that are required to be maintained in the United States for data localization. So the reality is that, governments have always looked for technology tools to deploy and meet their public policy needs. And I think the argument needs to be they should be doing that in a smart way and in an effective way. And we still would be better off if everybody was interconnected.
Thanks. Any other comments or thoughts on that question? Sure, please jump in.
Yeah, I agree. I would sort of add that in addition, there should be at least a common basis grounded in, democratic principles and human rights when it comes to minimum standards related to, surveillance, censorship, and other types of acts that kind of blend over into the technological but are rooted in political decision making. So the idea, on the one hand, certainly there's going to be discrepancy between rules that are being enacted and developed in the European context, for example, particularly as we see the passage of the Digital Markets Act, the near incipient passage of the Digital Services Act. You're going to see a varying degree of standards when it comes to privacy, platform operations, and so forth between different democracies. And yet there also should be a minimum standard when it comes to protecting online freedom of expression, when it comes to ensuring that there's minimal government interference as it relates to online communication, and that when there are rules that are enacted, that they're done so in a consistent way, reflecting underlying human rights priorities. When we see governments begin to stray from that, and that can be weaker democracies, India is a good case in point, Nigeria is another one, not to mention authoritarian states, that's when I think we're really seeing a further acceleration and a cutting up of online expression.
Thanks for that. So I want to dig into some of the specifics that we've seen. In particular, what we've, what was very notable in the past month is that Ukraine's digital minister basically made a number of direct requests to both private sector companies and groups like ICANN. So I want to go through some of these and get your reactions. So, for example, Ukraine asked ICANN to suspend Russia's country code top-level domain, and ICANN, refused. So, I think the question on the table is, did ICANN make the right decision? And, under what circumstances might ICANN consider revoking a country code top-level domain? And how has ICANN responded in past conflicts? Farzana, maybe we can start with you and Fiona as well.
Sure. So yes, I think ICANN made the right decision, and this is not the first time that country code level top level domain have been subjected to demands for removal, and as Fiona mentioned, it has happened in the past. And I think that we need to discuss this. I bring the perspective of ICANN is not, and these internet resources and institutions that govern them, they are not neutral. This decision was in favor of connectivity and not disconnecting a nation or people in order to achieve something that is also this is not going to help in any way Ukraine in digital space. So I think that this was a very good decision, and also the internet protocols and the RIPE that has the internet protocols for allocates the internet protocols for Russia also made the right decision to. They argued that they're neutral, but in effect they acted in favor of connectivity, and this is going to have. And if ICANN and RIPE made another decision and kind of introduced discrimination, then in the future we are going to have a lot of problems, because this is not the only conflict or war that is happening. And I think that at the internet infrastructure level, we should not in any circumstance introduce discrimination, because it cannot be proportionate and it cannot be effective, and it will affect us globally and not just like certain groups or regions.
Thanks. Fiona, or any others with reactions?
Yeah, I would just say that obviously I think what ICANN did was the right thing, and I applaud them for their response back. Especially, it's very difficult with what's going on. I will say this is not the first time there has been debates and conversations about country codes. It was very much the subject of the 5 years debate of the World Summit on the Information Society, 2003-2005 timeframe, and there's actually from that summit, a very clear recognition of the sovereign rights of countries when it comes to their country code. There are processes and there are rules around how to retire a country code if for some reason the country nomenclature changes or countries split apart and that kind of stuff. So there are processes and standards to follow. Country code identification comes from ISO, and ICANN follows that process. There were debates around all of this with Iraq, with Afghanistan when we were at NTIA. And, it was very important to the US government at the time to make clear that this is a system that we believe is a public trust involved in it. And it's this core resource of the internet is not where political battles should play out. In fact, in 2015, the US government actually filed an amicus brief. There was a case here in the DC court system where there was a law firm looking to get the assets of states that sponsor terrorism. And they actually sued ICANN to revoke the country codes of Iran, Syria, and North Korea. That they did not win that case, but the U.S. government, through the Solicitor General, actually filed a brief making the case that this is not the place to do this, and there's a public trust component of that. So I think the Ukraine request gets more. Obviously, it's current, it's contemporary. To your point, the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian digital minister is very effective in terms of making these requests of people and being very public. I think when all is said and done, and hopefully this is passed, it'll be really interesting to see what impact, the digital world has had on times of war and being able to keep up and see things like that. But the idea that countries or governments or people have tried to use this level of the infrastructure for geopolitics is not a new one. But I'm very happy to see that ICANN did the decision that they did. And I would just add this last point, which is a few years ago, the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, if I've gotten that name right, proposed a norm around the public core. And the idea was that these public core issues, whether it's IP numbers or domain names, should never be the subject of these kinds of disputes. And I would hope that this with this recent Ukraine issue gives us an opportunity to revisit the conversation about the public core and actually have a multi-stakeholder conversation about collectively adopting this as the public core norm as was proposed.
I'll chime in to build off of what both Fiona and Farzan have already said, which is that I also think that while infrastructure or lower layer requests like this aren't new, it does, I think, indicate a level of sophistication to make the requests. I would say that this is probably something that if we leave it to norm setting, like in the GCSC, or if we leave it to sort of framing of, there are certain things that are neutral, they should sort of operate as, as tools. I think that that sets us up for having these issues happen over and over again without a really specific response. And so I worry about that a bit. I do think it's worth, as I said before, thinking about what are the roles of these entities and what would constitute bad behavior. So can I give maybe a couple of examples in the case of this request? So to the request to RIPE, to revoke IP addresses of Russia. Now, I don't think that it should just never happen. I think that you could imagine a situation in which IP addresses are imagined to be the resources they are. I mean, IPv4 is relatively in demand, right? And especially in Europe, no less. So if you're going to hand over a bunch of essentially keys to the internet, and then as a steward, a nation state, you just throw them away, I think that that could be actionable. I don't think that's what Ukraine was saying, and I don't think that that is what Russia has done. But say that was proposed back in some years ago when network shutdowns in Africa were quite widespread. Someone had suggested maybe that Afrinic, the comparable institution to RIPE in Africa, should maybe not give away IP addresses if states are just going to use them to lure users into using the internet and then take those IP addresses away. So that's interesting, right? I don't necessarily condone it, but I think thinking more deeply about that would be useful. Another way that they also made a request was for DNS records and DNS routing. So previous to what Stephen said about the splinternet, I mean, Russia has been working on this angle for a while. Russia really does not like ICANN. I wish ICANN had called that out a little bit more in its letter, but they undermine ICANN at every possible turn by trying to come up with comparable standards to replace it in the ITU, which is a member-only place. And not participating in ICANN at all because it's a multi-stakeholder internet governance forum where they just wouldn't do well. But so this has been years in the making. They've asked several times the root server operators if they could have a root in Russia. Many root server operators operate out of Russia, but Russia does not have its own root server operator that is a Russian company, and have threatened for years to cut off from the internet at the DNS level. And they've tried it. The internet sovereignty law in Russia prescribes it. And this, I think, is actually sort of an attack on the root server system and the DNS, or it could be seen as such. Root server operators, therefore, have defined in a document what it means to be a rogue root server operator. It doesn't mention Russia. It doesn't mention anything political. It just describes what would the behavior of a DNS resolver be pretending to be a root server operator, and what do you do in response? Now, that is an example of incredibly actionable definitions of bad behavior. And I think almost all layers of the internet need to think very deeply about similar kinds of distinctions, rather than just sort of say, well, it's a norm that we don't touch the core of the internet, or it is a neutral thing, we cannot politicize it. That, I think, is too paper thin for the road ahead.
That's some great points. And Mallory, actually, I want to ask if you could stay and kind of expand on that to talk about the kind of moving up the stack to the DNS registrars, because we've seen, GoDaddy and Namecheap and some others that have cut off their Russian customers. So I wanted you to kind of reflect on that response, both in terms of the kind of appropriateness or, of the companies making those decisions, but also, obviously the registrars are governed by ICANN's registrar agreement, and whether, that is sufficient to cover these types of scenarios, getting to your point about thinking about bad behavior.
So I do think that when we look at sanctions and the way that they're defined, economic sanctions, it would include domain space. I mean, I'm not an economist, but look, we're talking about businesses, groups, so on, buying a space to put their website or to put their service online. That's not necessarily connectivity for individuals. And it is important, right, that independent media, alternative sources of news, nonprofit organizations, all those have their operating space online. We don't want to get in the habit of actioning censorship at the domain level. But I think from a transactional perspective, can you do business with a Russian entity? Like, that has implications for sanctions that I'm not really going to comment on, but just to set that aside, that it becomes complicated in that way. Again, like what I said before, the layer in which you are platforming a voice, information, that I think does get at the double-edged sword of censorship versus platforming, right? But individual registrars, and then of course, as you mentioned, ICANN, these are transactional agreements. And so again, it's an opportunity to define what does bad behavior look like, and what is unacceptable behavior. Those actually already exist because this is usually about a sort of money exchange, but then looking over those, which is so precisely what I said, that this is all subject to sanctions, but looking over those terms and conditions of those agreements for where then one could think about resilience and censorship hardening, so that legitimate or alternative or dissenting news sites, things like that, remain online. But then also looking at ways in which disinformation, coordinated inauthentic behavior, bots, all of that can also be actioned as well, because those are behaviors that are antithetical to an open, interoperable internet. Those are things that damage the network. And so again, thinking in those terms, I think it's important to get specific.
Fiona or Fazana, any thoughts on this question of the registrars specifically?
Yeah, so I have been active at ICANN for quite some time, and we need to keep ICANN's mandate and mission limited and technical. Otherwise, we will have ICANN getting involved with content moderation and all sorts of other things that it should not get involved with. Because and it doesn't have the authority, and it should not have the authority. And when it comes to the private governance of these registrars and what they want to do and who they want to serve, that is their private action, and their terms of service. Now, how that can affect people, and with the consolidation and all that, we can see that it could have a large effect on people when they make these decisions and their access to the internet. That is another topic. But the involvement of ICANN in regulating registrars in order to take action, especially in political situation, is a dangerous precedent, and it's going to affect the internet. And let me give you an example of the new GTLDs. The Dot Academy, for example, like they call it new GTLDs. They came up with this public at ICANN. We came up with a consensus policy that later on, kind of like they took on this consensus policy. The registrars took on these consensus policies, and then it led to some of the registrars having to sanction countries, having to comply with sanctions and not serving nor ordinary people in sanctioned countries. And that has had an effect already. So I think that it is that ICANN should have a very limited and technical mandate, and we can, of course, address all the other problems in other institutions. Thank you.
Fiona?
Yeah, I think I might just add that, ICANN and the sort of the multi-stakeholder community that it exists doesn't exist in a planet all on its own. So ICANN administers a series of contracts, and all the parties involved in those contracts are subject to their local regimes and their local laws. And so sanctions do currently exist with respect to the sale of registration services. And in fact, even for ICANN, when they're processing a change request or an update to the root zone file for a country that's on the current US sanctions list, ICANN has to get a license. So the US Treasury Department through OFAC has a process to administer that, and OFAC grants the license given the policy of the United States about the importance of these public core resources. Same thing for registries and registrars. If they choose to do business or their customers are on a sanctions list, they can go through the process and they can request a license. So again, this isn't new, and it's I think it's already addressed in the system. I think the question that makes the current conversation much more, I think raises the profile more, is to the extent and to the speed. And I think broader, at least from my perspective, the effectiveness by which the Ukraine ministry has been and the digital minister has been to do this across the entire digital ecosystem. But again, the idea that this is the first time someone has asked these questions of the companies or has asked this question of the domain name system is not correct. It's always been there. It just hasn't been as public or as higher profile. And I don't think we've lived in a world before where like war is being broadcast real time by citizens as it occurs and people can see and keep up. And I think that raises the stakes a little bit more for people in terms of how it's unfolding.
Thanks. I agree with those comments, and I think it's one of the things that I think is so important for a lot of people who are coming to this debate for the first time to understand that it's not necessarily new, but it might be the first time a lot of people are hearing about it, and it's the first time a lot of people are weighing in on it. And what we've seen in a lot of technology debates is things change quickly when you have a lot of new people weighing in on something, especially in a forum that is supposed to be multi-stakeholder. Stephen, I wanted to pivot to you. You've written, quite a bit in the past about, internet shutdowns and internet blockages. And so, one thing that I think is kind of unique in this situation, or maybe not unique, but that is a lot of companies are wrestling with right now, is that Russia has blocked or throttled many social media companies or social media platforms, sometimes parts of them and not others. And when we're talking about sanctions, most of these companies are maybe not doing business in Russia in the sense that they're not, they don't have paid advertisers that they're now soliciting business from. But the question is, are they still have users in these countries, and what's their role there? So I wonder if you could kind of reflect on, what the work that you've done on how companies should be thinking about forced internet shutdowns, what their response should be, and how that's playing out right now in Russia.
Yeah, great. Well, I'll give you an example of something a company should not be doing, which is TikTok, which is that in order to sort of remain uncensored or remain unblocked in Russia, is taking down Russian users' ability to access content externally. So if you're looking to see, TikTok war footage, as it relates to Ukraine, and you're a Russian user, most of that is now blocked, and that's essentially TikTok's way to sort of chart a middle ground between being allowed to sort of stay operational in Russia while still, sort of showing to, at least in the outside world, allowing the platform to broadcast different images. And so, I think what we're actually looking at is that there's a tough line that platforms have been trying to tread for a while, particularly in the Russia situation. I think last year it came to light in the wake of a voting app that Navalny's group had put out that was then taken down from the Google's, Google Play Store and the Apple Store as well, that there was a shakedown involving Russian authorities and a senior Google executive in Moscow. And so, what we saw in a situation like that is that ultimately Google acceded to Russian demands. There was heavy coercion involved by the Russian authorities. But at the end of the day, by acceding to those demands, Google didn't sort of stop that coercion from continuing and persisting to the point where it is right now. So in other words, the more companies, I think, try to placate coercive governments by giving in to demands that violate persistently core human rights principles, I don't think that those compromises end up putting companies in a good place. I think instead what happens is that, one, you set a precedent where governments increasingly will demand more and more content takedowns and so forth. And two, you're just merely kicking the can down the road anyway until ultimately a platform will have to make a decision about whether to pull up stakes, or at least to to have local employees leave, and then come what may. And so what's the line? Like, what's the balance? I mean, we see compromises occur around the world, whether it's in Vietnam, Facebook quietly taking down content upon the request of the Vietnamese government, or else facing throttling, or we see Twitter in Nigeria, in India, making opaque compromises in order to restore a suspension of services in the case of Nigeria. What is the line when it comes to those platforms, and what is their obligations to the user base? And I would say that it's not easy, but that I think, again, reverting back to core human rights principles and using that as a means to assess a balance of harms, and ultimately decide not to give in to those restrictions, is probably the best course of action at the end of the day.
Any other thoughts on that, Mallory? Maybe, I know you've looked at these issues as well.
Yeah, no, I really want to appreciate what Stephen says, because it's right on. Just normalizing this is not the right move, and impressing upon democratic governments to always carve out the internet connectivity at all costs. Like, that's really, really critical. But then, there's that gap in guidance, right, that we've talked about to companies. And I think that gap, maybe as a proposal, could be played a little bit more by standards bodies or by industry associations, like the ones that have in some part responded to this. I think that there was a missed opportunity for ICANN to maybe reframe the request and to help the registries, registrars, to understand maybe what a proper response would be. There's certainly a lot to be said in the routing community as well. There may be even more to be said, because as Russia as censor is blocking social media companies, it's inadvertently poisoning and having an effect on routing and other parts of the internet, which is something that we say about why it's not okay to make these blocks, because it will have knock-on effects elsewhere. So then how to deal with that? How to get the routing community back together when network operators in Russia are hardly able to even be a sort of constituency in a repressive regime like that. The network at the end of the day, especially when it comes to routing, is very much a network of people and trust relationships, in addition to the peer relationships and the transactional relationships that are often not even written down. But nonetheless, right, the point remains that we need to think of these as communities of practice amongst different companies to try to foster correct approaches, and to make it feel, again, like the best thing that can be done in times of conflict is just to make sure there's connectivity at all costs. So yeah, I think that that would have been, I think, a better response. But although I do, at the end of the day, agree with a lot of the statements that the ISTAR organizations have made, I just want there to be a more of an acknowledgement of that sort of central role that those bodies play. Also, because we know that there may have been other requests made more specific and targeted to individual companies, like the ones we saw done more publicly. And so being able to, again, like as Stephen said, just like resist that tendency to want to block or to want to censor, to give the industry the tools it needs to feel like it can both resist it technically and resist it sort of politically, based on a fundamental commitment to human rights. Like that's really powerful.
Farzana, you've written about what you termed multi-stakeholder washing. And I wonder, as we, building off of kind of Mallory's remarks here, as we think about moving forward, how do we balance this so that it is not just maybe a Western response to a specific goal or objective? How do we make sure that those goals the kind of intrinsic goals that we've set up of, that we value in the internet, this multi-stakeholder approach? How do we make sure that doesn't get kind of pushed aside by, a Western desire to do X or Y?
So I think that we need the internet. I think that when it comes to the internet, when we talk about the open internet, there's no other alternative. When there's no open internet, there's no internet. And we need to go beyond thinking in terms of like borders and nations, and think about this issue of keeping the internet open and accessible, of opening it to people around the world. And in that way, when something in Afghanistan happens, which 6 months ago, when Taliban took over, we were really worried about their internet resources and what is going to happen to them. And then we should, if we think about it as a global source, then we will act more collectively, and we will have more inclusivity to give people platforms to discuss. And multi-stakeholderism and multi-stakeholder approaches have worked. At ICANN, for example, I, as an Iranian individual, I can go and be on equal footing. I can participate in those processes, and the government cannot shut me down. The government cannot say you are not a representative. You cannot participate in these processes. So multi-stakeholder approaches work. What doesn't work is to just get that tag of multi-stakeholderism and just tag it to any bad idea, like, for example, imposition of sanctions on the internet. How is that going to work? And why should we impose sanctions? Why can't we think about other solutions that keep the internet open and global and diverse, but at the same time helps Ukraine and people in conflict and war? And this is what I meant in the blog about the multi-stakeholder washing. That these initiatives, we should not kind of get hyped by a terrible invasion and think and kind of like undertake attacks on the principles that internet abide by, and kept it open and global. And I know there are limitations, but at the moment, I don't need a visa to have access to the internet in other countries. If I want to go to another country, I need a visa. So let's not bring these geopolitical issues in this way to the internet that are not going to be effective. They are not going to, these solutions are not going to be effective, not going to help Ukraine, not going to help others, and are going to affect the essential properties of the internet.
Thanks so much for that. I wanted to remind everyone watching that, again, we are taking questions for the panel. You can submit them on Slido at the link on the webpage on itif.org, or the link is also in the video description if you're watching on social media. We found a few questions in. The first question, Fiona, I'll send this one to you. The question is, how might the conflict in Ukraine reshape the cyber norms debate?
So I think the conversation on cyber norms has been happening in two places in the UN system, the group of governmental experts, the GGE, but also the open-ended working group. And that open-ended working group actually, I think, met last week in New York. And I believe this is the conversation and the exercise to talk about having an internet treaty of sorts. And I believe what ended up happening was a lot of the conversation was taken up with statements from governments condemning Russia. and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so in these UN systems, everything is very politicized. And so when something like this happens, it undermines it. There was also a lot of comments and interventions made as I watched some of the meeting about states questioning how could we trust the intent of Russia, since Russia was the one that had spurred and called for this open-ended working group. So I think there's definitely an impact that's happening in that space. I would say, in terms of going forward and what to do and how to have this conversation, I think, Mallory's suggestion that ICANN could have done a better job by helping inform registries and registrars and giving them guidance. That sounds great, but registries and registrars wouldn't want that advice from ICANN. That community and that environment, ICANN is their regulator, so to speak, and they don't see them as a partner in these kinds of issues. So it would have been a very unwelcome overture, I think, from the contracted parties if ICANN tried to do that. I think that's one of the reasons why, years ago we created the Internet Governance Forum. I think the Internet Governance Forum this year, the global one, will be in Ethiopia, maybe September, maybe November. I don't remember the dates. I think this is a prime time to have these conversations, Internet Governance Forum, because it brings together all the stakeholders involved in the value chain of internet connectivity. They can have these conversations, and you can talk about norms and dig into some of the issues that Mallory raised about, is the public core norm sufficient? Do you need to be doing more, and what could you do? We could also start that conversation here in Washington, D.C. with the IGF USA, which I think is happening mid to late July. I don't know the exact date, but I think those are the forums and the place to have these conversations, to provide more clarity, to dig in a little bit more and have a conversation so people can think about how they want to take it back and operate it in their world that they work in.
Thanks for that. I want to spend a few minutes as we wrap up, kind of looking forward. One question that I know has been on many people's mind is kind of, what about China? Russia obviously isn't China, but there have been many concerns about what the lessons from Russia's invasion of Ukraine will have on how China might approach potential future military aggression. So what additional considerations, if any, do you think Western companies should bear in mind if we were confronted with that type of scenario? Or just kind of going forward, if anyone doesn't want to comment specifically in China, what do you think companies should be thinking about in terms of making decisions about where they operate? Maybe Stephen, you can start with this, because you were making some points kind of along those lines about companies need to be sure about where that line is that they're going to draw.
Well, it's a tough question to kind of answer in a couple minutes, but I guess there's a few things. I think, first of all, the Russian market presents very different challenges than the Chinese market, both in terms of just the nature of the interconnection between U.S. companies, Chinese technology, and their market as well. It's a much bigger market. It's much more complex. And there are many more companies that are embedded in both directions versus in Russia. I think there's already geopolitical signals that companies are thinking about when it comes to a greater push for more decoupling or generally to think about sort of the kind of onshoring movement that's taking place, in part because of decisions that are being made regarding Chinese technology companies and their ability to service U.S. markets that are premised on political issues, whether it's issues related to Xinjiang or other issues related to political crackdowns and geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China. It's hard for me to imagine that assuming the status quo remains when it comes to politically the U.S. and China and the tensions therein, that companies won't continue to sort of see greater warning signals about sanctions that potentially are forthcoming, subsequent tensions that may arise, and the consequences therein when it comes to supply chains, when it comes to markets, and so on. So I think probably the watchword is, be ready, think about potentially where these trends may go, and what are alternatives that are available if there are further restrictions when it comes to supplying chip manufacturing, when there are further restrictions when it comes to sourcing different types of products and so forth. What does that mean, and what are alternatives that are available for companies to source from? And I think we're seeing that kind of movement take place anyway, but this probably throws into sharper relief the fact that democracies are showing a very large political willingness to step forward in pretty significant ways when it comes to sanctions and other policies that are linked to geopolitical tensions.
If I could add to what Stephen was saying about how to do future planning around this sort of scenario, is that it's very difficult to put internet connectivity back after it's been taken away. I think a lot of folks that wish they had done more before this to strengthen networks in Ukraine in particular, by the time it seemed a dire situation, it was too late. So it's an important step for China, for lots of parts of the world that are affected by China's telecommunications and infrastructure development, to think about network resilience and network hardening now, because once that internet connectivity is cut off or compromised or made more difficult, it is not a situation in which you can send satellites. I mean, you can, but with great risk and with trade-offs. And you can't send up balloons like we learned in Cuba. You could, for example, make some protocols a little harder, like VPNs should be hardened, those sorts of things. Software, not just infrastructure. But yes, think about these things now and how to provide more services, not restrict services. As Stephen was saying as well, like source things. I mean, have backup. That all sounds like very good for the internet.
So we could have another audience question that came in. We probably have time for one more here. The question is, could we see more homegrown versions of popular apps like Instagram in each country as governments enact bans? What impact would that have on the splinternet? Farzana, will you take this one?
Yes, so we already see those kind of apps that governments try to also encourage, and every time, and especially sanctioned countries are very much, because usually they're authoritarian countries. They usually promote the use of these local apps because they don't have. The people don't have the access to the other apps are difficult because of the filtering and blocking inside the country, and also the sanctions. And so that in that case, it becomes those apps, those local apps can gain some traction and some users, and this can have effect to. So this kind of makes the authoritarian countries work easier, because they can do more surveillance. They can also like have block access to the outside world, and create that like blocking access to the internet, and also make people feel that, well, I have access to these local services anyway. So yes, it is very possible. I just wanted to note that I believe that we should definitely think about demilitarization of the internet, and we should definitely think about how we can effectively sanction those who are using the internet in order to undertake attacks. But I don't think that these sanctions and localization and these solutions are really will provide an effective remedy for people and the internet. Thanks.
Fiona, I just want to give you the last word. We have about 2 minutes left. Steve earlier talked about, that what's happening in Russia and other places is the result of a repressive legal apparatus. Farzana's talked about the need for demilitarization of the internet. I guess my question for you is, as these issues now really permeate more of internet policy, or if you, I guess part of the question is, do you think it will? Is there anything different you would like to see U.S. policy and U.S. policymakers do in regard to internet policy to push back on these types of threats globally?
Yeah, I think it's important that, the United States and democratic countries and those that are supportive of an open, interoperable global internet don't ever lose sight of the need to say that and the need to safeguard it, because you can't take things for granted and you always have to keep working at it to make it happen. I will point out the irony that the Russian Federation was better protected in the multi-stakeholder model than it has been in the UN system. So while the Ukrainian minister asked both RIPE and ICANN to take away their internet resources, both said no. But in the ITU's World Telecom Standardization Assembly, which happened last month, the Russian government was stripped of its leadership positions in the study groups at the request of Ukraine. So even though the Russian Federation participates in ICANN, but at every turn always wants to have it be taken over by the ITU or replace it, it was ironic to me that the multi-stakeholder model actually better protected the people of Russia and the internet than the UN system where the Russian government was actually stripped of its role. So again, I would just always encourage everybody to don't take things for granted. Be very clear with what you want, and you've got to always argue for the open internet and protect it. It's not an assured thing.
Thank you all so much for participating in the conversation today. Thanks to everyone who joined us online, who was watching. There's obviously more we could do and say and write about on this topic. I encourage you to check out the writings, though, of all of their panelists. They've put out some excellent work on these topics. So thank you again.